also first published in 1947. The difference between them is political. Unlike Lévy, Antelme draws from his ontological thesis the conclusion that those systems, in his analysis, capitalism and colonialism, which behave as if it were indeed possible to impose divisions on the human race, must be actively resisted. For Antelme, ontological solidarity imposes communist engagement. Now this introduces a difficult question, which brings us in many ways to the heart of the matter, namely, the question of collective political subjectivation. Under what conditions, and by virtue of what actions, does a collective political subject take shape? Those whose exploitation is defined by the theft of all positive attributes are at risk, to put it mildly, of finding themselves exiled from any effective political subjectivation. How, then, beyond the imminent revelation of its evident injustice, is such exploitation to be resisted? To answer this, we need to consider the signal contribution of recent times to our understanding of this process of subjectivation, namely the work of Jacques Rancière. For Rancière, politics as such takes place only on those rare occasions of mésentente, as he puts it, of dissensus, when a group formerly excluded from the count of effective political subjects asserts its right to be included in this count. Previously, the complaints of such a group had constituted just so much noise, an unreasoning, immediate expression of displeasure, a background, static hum which those endowed with political agency could safely allow themselves to tune out. Now, however, demonstrating that they are indeed possessed of that reason which qualifies them as eligible for political subjecthood, the members of the group have managed to have this brute phone accepted as a form of meaningful logos. The question, accordingly, is one of articulation. How is the demand of those whose previous utterances have been dismissed as so many grunts to get itself received as reasonable discourse? How are they to move from the symbolic silence of exclusion, where their words are just noise, to the language of effective participation? It is, of course, possible to give a purely descriptive answer to this question, and simply to define politics as what happens when such an articulation succeeds. But, despite representing Rancière's implicit answer to this question, this is little more than tautological, and hardly satisfactory. We need, rather, to consider further the nature of the political arena. Granted, the bare cry of suffering is not yet a political act. It lacks articulation, precisely. Does this mean that the demand this cry expresses can simply be ignored? Far from it. Rather, Rancière's analysis allows us to see that, just as an inarticulate demand will be effective only when it is taken up by someone whose voice counts, so is this meaningful voice in a position to act as a point of articulation between the political realm and those this realm excludes. In addition to understanding politics as the constitution of effective subjecthood on the basis of an indisputably reasonable voice, as in Rancière's outstanding analyses of the formation of the political names of women or the proletariat, for example, I would argue that we should also understand and seek to realize this process as a perpetual shuttling between inside and outside, included and excluded, reasonable and brutish. And I would argue this particularly because the forms of political subjectivation we need to invent today will have little purchase if they are unable to proceed alongside those whose exploitation is defined by their exclusion from articulation. When exploitation proceeds by that form of dehumanization which consists in the denial of any effective voice, a politics of emancipation must by definition understand itself as the articulation of the demand for equality already proclaimed by the existence of the voiceless. In the Nazi concentration camps, but elsewhere too, in various colonial regimes, for example, as well as our contemporary forms of sublegal detention, clandestine disappearance, and more or less outsourced torture, oppression proceeds by willfully dehumanizing practices designed knowingly to remove from those exposed to them such positive attributes as are supposed to constitute the humanity of human beings, who find themselves subsequently described as less than human, of course, as scum, perhaps, or a mob, a horde. But this is hardly a calmly objective description. Rather, the act of naming is itself part of the oppression in question. In the face of these diverse practices, which have as their aim the removal of any voice, the task of the currently effective political subject is perhaps that described best by Blanchot in his account of En termes de l'espèce humaine, namely, to pick up and to support the demand of the voiceless, to take up and to hold open the possibility of their struggle. To fight, that is, with and where necessary for those excluded from the fight, for, as Deleuze and Guattari say, not as in on behalf of, but as in owing responsibility to. To understand our equalities inscribed already in our existence as such gives us a basis on which to fight with and where necessary for those whose misery is defined by their exclusion from any form of effective symbolization. This exorbitant understanding allows us to refuse the fraudulent division between human and subhuman, and to refuse the repetition of this division in that between political actors and absolute victims, between the saved and the drowned, as Primo Levi put it, to recall the former's responsibility to the latter. Egalitarian political subjecthood is available to all, including those unable to actualize its potential. There is no form of misery which would be somehow beneath politics, just as there is no human existence which would be somehow subhuman. There are just demands which remain to be heard, utterances yet to be understood. Not that every utterance, when understood, need be embraced. The task is continually to open the arena within which the voices are to be heard, not to abandon the criteria by which their claims are to be judged. The reduction of human beings to the most extreme forms of destitution reveals not some kind of shameful substance on the basis of which the human might be divided up, but, rather, our irreducibly common exposure to finitude, thanks to which it becomes both possible and urgent to denounce the production of this destitution as a form of domination. And when this production defines forms of impoverishment newly invented and required as the corollary to new kinds of profit, then a politics of emancipation cannot limit itself to already existing political actors, but must open itself evermore to those subaltern groups exiled from functioning networks of articulation. Exorbitant and irredentist, impatient of its own limits, such a politics has at least the merit of insinuating itself along those contemporary capillaries in which domination becomes ever more intimate, precisely by finding ways to duck under the established radar of symbolization and subjectivation. Against this merit, we need to weigh up the risks of this politics. These are essentially threefold. First, the risk that the definition of the human in terms of finitude locks us into an account of our existence as a form of metaphysical victimhood. Secondly, the risk that affirming an exorbitant political subjectivation on the basis of destitution will simply sanctify some and further exclude others. Thirdly, the risk that any talk of politics and ontology in the same breath will lead to a fascistic political theology. Let me deal with these risks, which are real, in order. There is a fear, among those hostile to the definition of human existence in terms of exposure to finitude, that this exposure simply amounts to a form of imprisonment. This criticism rests on a, perhaps understandable, refusal to acknowledge the significance of the rethinking of the limit that I sketched above. For its proponents, there is no difference between finiteness and finitude. For these critics, principally Rancière and Badiou, the defining openness of this finitude reduces to the miserable Christian vision, in which it does indeed, as we saw above, have its origins, of the human being as a poor, fallen creature exposed to a life of suffering from which only divine salvation offers any escape. Accordingly, since our existence is in this vision by definition one of misery, all politically inflicted suffering comes to appear as a kind of metaphysical destiny, against which there is nothing to be done, and in relation to which our only forms of action are prayer and charity. Now, there is something to be said for this criticism. Specifically, it produces an incisive and merited denunciation of the role of humanitarianism as an alibi for the perpetuation of globalized economic exploitation, in which every disaster, from hurricane to famine to massacre, is cast as a natural disaster, the response to which can at best be palliative. But the criticism has it back to front, to my mind, when it argues that it is the definition of human existence in terms of finitude that produces this knowing depoliticization. That, as Badiou has it with reference to the Nazi concentration camps, if we define human beings as suffering animals, then this is how they will be treated. Attempted dehumanization proceeds not on the assumption of our universally miserable condition, but rather as a campaign to fabricate a supposed subhumanity, which it can then claim to have revealed, elevating itself in return to the status of the truly, exclusively human. The refusal to define human existence in terms of exposure to finitude, on the grounds that this collapses all political agency into metaphysical victimhood, ends up accepting the terms offered by the oppressor, namely, that mute suffering makes no political claim. This is not a position we should embrace, for it locks in the distinction between fully human, effective political subjects on the one hand, and brute victims on the other. The irreducible equality declared by our existence in common as exposure to finitude rejects any such separation, and insists that in every form of exploitation, a political demand is already immanent. Every victim is already a potential political subject. The task is to see whether or not any given instance of victimization can be articulated as a demand for political subjectivation, to seek to traverse the boundary between speech and silence, to relay such potential articulation. In this sense, the definition of our existence in terms of finitude functions precisely, if exorbitantly, as the kind of political speech act analysed by Rancière and embraced by Badiou. It makes an egalitarian claim which must then be tested in particular cases. The term human being is indeed, as Rancière points out, invariably used to block any such procedures of verification at source, confusing determinate forms of injustice in a generalized pit of misfortune. The insistence on opening the political arena ever more to the victims of extreme destitution does, of course, risk this kind of metaphysical slippage. This is where we can feel the pinch of the vestigial tie to finiteness of this politics of finitude, in the insistence that we must have some truck with the negativity of privation, lack, want, etc. This persistence is of the order not of an indiscriminate destiny, however, but rather of a political possibility, in which the interest of this vestigial tie can also be felt. Destitution is already a form of injustice, not because we are all suffering creatures. In this case, it would indeed be nothing more than a destiny. On the contrary, the oppressor's pretense that destitution is merely the materialization of our miserable, all too human lot can be challenged by the equality to which every existence lays its immanent claim. The destitute are potential political subjects, not because we are all doomed to misery, but because their current condition constitutes the abusive attempt to reduce the finitude, which is our true equality, to the finiteness in which this equality finds its ideological travesty. This indicates precisely that, rather than accept the falsely neutralizing terms we are offered, in this case, for example, the human, rather, these terms need to be tested. And in this case, the definition of human existence from finitude gives us exactly the weapon we need, namely, a political articulation of this term, thanks to which the ideological function of its humanitarian phrasing, to mask the gap between existential equality and concrete inequality, becomes apparent with especial clarity. The second criticism to consider, which is also that, for example, levelled at Agamben's argument